Hey guys, my name is Cameron Suter, and I've been working as a professional concept artist and illustrator for the past decade. If you're new here, then welcome. This is where I'll be breaking down how I've made concept art like this for the Ark Aquatica DLC, and also sharing how I've got to this point in my artistic journey. So if you feel that AI and other tools are rendering concept artists as obsolete, I'm here to tell you that just the opposite is true. And maybe you have a heart like mine for building on the real fundamental skills of making hand-drawn art. If that's the case, then stick around. We're going to cover that and much more here. So go ahead and leave a like to push this forward in the algorithm, and if I've earned it by the end of this video, subscribe for more content like this. As a lover of nature, sci-fi, and fantasy, creature design has long been a pillar of my art practice. So the opportunity to work on such a notable IP as Ark was super exciting to me, especially when I learned that it would be to develop the concepts of the main bosses in Aquatica. In this video, I'm going to take you with me from beginning sketches to this finalized concept image. The timestamps are noted below, so you can revisit any section more in depth. Then, in a video after this one, I'll be showing you how I developed this illustration based on our finalized concept. My workflow for illustrations is a bit different than the concepts we'll cover here, but as you'll see, fits together to bring these ideas forward in their best light. The first of which was the Lava Serpent, also known as the Volcanithus. You might recognize this from the promotional illustration that I also did for Aquatica. The concept for this boss was a large, leviathan-like serpent that lives in the magma pools of Aquatica's boiling sea, which is just so epic. Development begins with what I like to call the blue sky phase. This is the initial stage of a project where the artist explores the far extents that the project can go, according to the brief provided by the client. This brief is often a PDF or slide deck that describes the physical descriptions of the creature. In this case, where it lives, how it moves, potential gameplay mechanics, and some reference images. And while every client is different, this may also contain some of the technical specs for the project, including the needed file sizes, where to send them, how to contact the client, and so on. Which is why I jumped right into the full body sketch you see me developing here. Though it may not be a bad idea to also warm up with some smaller and looser thumbnail sketches. But for this concept, I thought to combine the idea of a plated serpent with other undersea animals, such as augmenting the jaw with gulper eel anatomy, pushing the already hinged nature of a snake jaw into something really wild. Next, I explored the idea of a snake hood that's crowned in hydrothermal vents, such as you see here. All of these are actually real things in the bottom of the ocean, which always serves as an amazingly alien source of inspiration for creature concepts. This also serves to tie in the undersea volcano theme of the game environment. And for the body itself, I drew plates that incorporate a similar shape language to the vents, and designed the tail similarly. Finding ways of repeating shapes in your design, like these squared off spikes, go a long way to making your choices actually feel really intentional. And with this finish, I had a pretty good start, but wanted to provide more iterations to fully explore the brief. So I decided on different versions of the head, as that's the focal point and will guide the rest of the body anyway. Here, it can be helpful to think of a sort of spectrum of opposing qualities to help push your design in new ways. You might think of qualities like grace versus power, ancient versus futuristic, functional versus ornamental, and so on. For my concept, I chose realistic versus fantastical, with believable snake-like features on one end and more speculative dragon-like features on the other. My first sketch sat more on the snake end, So for the next iteration, I push it a bit more toward the center, still keeping it streamlined like an undersea snake, but also giving it more interesting scales that might act like gills. I imagine how this creature could swim through both water and lava, and let that kind of inform the design. In particular, my mind went to shark gills, which can actually flare open a bit to reveal the inside of the shark's throat. And taking that feature, I push it a bit more toward fantasy, by imagining where the serpent might have internal heat or magma showing in its throat instead. You can also see that I'm thinking about how to morph the more streamlined shapes of the face into the squared off ridge of the back, still wanting to keep that vent feature of my full body concept. The second iteration was made much more dragon-like, as a means of pushing it all the way to that fantasy side of the spectrum. Similar to the previous concept, I'm still wanting the scales to wrap around the form and suggest a sort of rocky material like cooled lava. As a quick note, I wanted to call out how I approach sketching. I'll often loosely mark out the biggest shape, like the neck here, and then picture how the smaller forms would sit on top. I'm imagining the neck as a three-dimensional tube that the scales will sit on top of and curve around. Once I have things placed, I'll then go back in with darker line weight and also the eraser to add and carve away at the shapes until I'm happy. However, as this one came together, I felt like it was becoming too dragon-like, so much so that it lost the original serpentine nature that was suggested in the brief. So for the third iteration, I made it to sit in between the last two, taking inspiration from monsters like kaiju, something a bit snake-like but also not a traditional dragon. For this one, I had the idea of creating unique plates that grow up toward the jaw and become a secondary set of teeth. In my mind, they would be shed and constantly replaced, similar to shark teeth. To do this, I duplicate each plate to quickly make a series of them. But each time, I'm making the teeth within the plate smaller, as though the ones in the back haven't grown out as much yet. I also replicate the appearance of layered or plated spikes throughout the whole design, including the back ridge, obviously, but also in the tongue as well. I also took inspiration from what snakes look like when they swallow eggs, to imagine a pouch that stores up lava that can then be spewed at the player as an attack. Again, taking cues from the real world and applying it toward fantasy, which is a pillar of functional concept art. In putting together this sheet, I provided some callouts indicating the materials and textures I imagine each concept to be made of: obsidian-like plates, scales of cooled lava, and hot magma glowing from within. At this early stage of development, it really doesn't make sense to sink a lot of time into rendering out all of these materials, since they could change pretty drastically from the client's feedback. Instead, quick callouts like these can be more than enough to get the idea across. But for now, these are the sheets that I finished, and I was ready for my first official check-in with the team. I want to pause here for a moment to talk about some of the professional skills that will keep your clients coming back to you. Producing quality artwork is obviously important, but there are social skills that I've had to learn over the years too. And believe me when I say that a single, thoughtful conversation with your client can save you weeks of unnecessary work. The frequency and structure of these meetings will vary per client. They may be discussions with the art director and/or with other artists on the team. Regardless, I want to share a roadmap that I use to make sure that these meetings go well. First, we gotta talk about being organized. Even if this is your first real freelance gig, the way that you carry yourself into these meetings can make up for a certain lack of professional experience. I like to make sure that I have all the artwork the client is expecting to see organized in easily readable sheets like these. I'll make sure to have these pulled up in another window prior to joining the call, so that I'm not fumbling for the right images when it's my turn to present. And if for some reason you don't have the images that the client is expecting to see, this should be communicated to them prior to the call so that they can facilitate accordingly. Secondly, let's talk about preparing your space. This is more so a general note for online meetings, but if you're going to be on camera, having a simple background and adequate lighting can go a long way to coming off professionally. And don't worry, this doesn't mean having the whole influencer streamer setup with RGB lights everywhere, just something clean and non-distracting. Thirdly, it helps to know a bit of what you plan to say beforehand. You may feel that your artwork should just speak for itself, but it doesn't hurt to clearly describe your thought process and intentions, especially if you explore the far ends of the project brief. Fourth is to be postured for feedback. Remember that your role as a concept artist is to provide the visuals that your client can think on. The art directors and others giving you feedback will be actively honing the vision in light of what you share, which is actually a really empowering part of concept art. That said, when a client says they like one design more than another, realize that this is not an attack on you, your skills, or your ideas. Rather, these sort of discussions are exactly what good concept art invites, so view them as stepping stones leading you to the final design. And lastly is to ask questions. Before you leave the meeting with your client, it's your job to make sure you have all the information you need to fulfill the next stage of development. So asking for reference images or explanations is super encouraged and only benefits the rest of the team, as others might be thinking those questions as well. And shifting back to the Lava Serpent, this was the head that we had decided on from that meeting. So let's talk rendering. This means to develop the three-dimensional form of a concept, building out its color and its texture. This will show the materials that it's made of and how it relates to its environment. You can see I pulled some images of lava to reference and begin laying in the base tones. When rendering heat effects, it's useful to know that the colors generally shift from red, orange, yellow, then to white as it gets hotter. One of the many lessons I've learned from these books by James Gurney. So I begin by laying in some of those red tones, which I'll shift as I get closer to the heat source within the serpent's body. I also make little swatches of those colors as I go along, which gives me a clear area to color pick from, which in Photoshop you can do by holding Alt or Option while using the brush tool. The goal here is to create the sense that its insides are hot like a furnace, and I also give the teeth a similar treatment, as though the serpent can concentrate heat into its bite. Thus far, I've just been painting on a normal layer, but once I'm happy with the base tones, I'll go in with a soft brush on a layer set to linear dodge, which will help to give a more ambient glow to the heat effect. Darkening the background will help show this too, which I'll do now after redoing the eye. Next, I want to bring out the midtones of the plates, so I grab a cool, lighter gray to begin painting. I notice in my reference how the cooled lava sort of bunches up on itself and catches the light, and I use that to guide the texture that I'm trying to emulate. I find when painting over line art like this, my mind goes into autopilot, but in a kind of good way. Whereas the initial concept sketches require me to think about interesting shapes and functional anatomy and uniquely fulfilling the brief all at once, rendering like this is merely fleshing out what I've already thought through. It's a nice mental break, and one that makes the hours pass by really quickly. A couple things to notice around the mouth. One, I try to keep the midtones of the flesh really saturated to emulate something called subsurface scattering. This occurs when the light passes through a translucent material like skin. You've likely seen this before if you shine a light behind your fingers and see the glow between them. The same thing will happen here in the serpent's mouth from the light being emitted in its throat. But that same light will also cast a little bit of rim light, which you see I add at the base of the upper jaw. Generally, it's a great idea to stay as zoomed out as possible when working digitally. This is so that you don't get tunnel vision on a single part of your design, but also so that you can work more quickly. However, there will be times when you gotta zoom in, such as I am here when working on the teeth, but you should never be so zoomed in that you're seeing individual pixels. That either means that you're way too close or that you should be working on a larger document size. Another technique that can help you work faster is to fully work out one part of your design and then copy it to wherever it's repeated. Such as with the teeth here, I just lasso around the largest fang and then duplicate it to create the top set. You can use the liquefy filter to morph things a little bit and then just go from there. I'll end up using this technique a lot when developing the other poses of the serpent too. I'm about finished with rendering out this piece, but a quick note on using photo textures. I generally steer away from it in my work, which is just a personal preference, but it can have its place. Here I use images of fire that I set to different blending modes to suggest the heat that's emanating from the serpent. A little goes a long way, but it can be a nice touch. I also use some custom brushes from sites like BrushEasy, which can be great tools to have in your pocket. Here I have some in the shape of swirls of smoke to just add additional atmosphere. I also developed an enraged version of the serpent, where its gills are dilated and the intensity of heat and light is brought up even further. All of this is saved within its own group of layers that I can toggle on and off within my painting program. But otherwise, this follows the same process as before. Which reminds me of something I heard from a panel of concept artists once. They shared that, after a while, some of the more technical skills simply become second nature. And I can remember as a beginner artist listening to them, thinking that I'd never get to the point where rendering complex materials would feel easy or mindless. But you'd be amazed how your brain begins to wire around the fundamentals after enough time. The key is to stay in the moment and not allow where you want to be to distract you from where you're growing right now. To paraphrase what James Clear writes in Atomic Habits, if you establish the correct inputs, the score will take care of itself in due time. It's not those who have the most quote-unquote natural talent, but those most unwilling to quit that reach the highest levels of their craft. And might I just add, this is one of the things that you can't shortcut your way into with AI or other tools. It requires diligence and training and almost an old school mindset to craft that I don't want to lose. Now that I have the forms rendered out, I want to do an anatomy call out to show the functionality of the design. These details may or may not become moving parts in the final gameplay model, but exploring them up front as a concept artist gives the rest of the team options as things are modeled, rigged, and animated. Here I'm thinking about how the serpent breathes, especially since the battle takes place entirely underwater. But in the world of Aquatica, this creature swims not only through water, but also in the flows of lava that course through the boiling seas. And as it goes through lava, I imagine how it might pass it through its open mouth and out of the gills, again like how sharks respirate. This is how the serpent extracts the chemically bound oxygen from the lava silicate. And yes, I literally researched all of this. The wells go pretty deep. I also wanted to explore how the serpent could potentially breathe on land, in case that ever came up within the gameplay development. I knew of animals such as the lungfish, which have the capability of breathing in water and air, so perhaps the idea isn't so far-fetched. To do this, I introduced a structure called the glottis. Humans have a glottis, actually. It's the opening between the vocal folds in our throat. In snakes, the glottis extends as a tube into its mouth that it can then use to respirate even when the mouth is full while eating. This is a small detail to include in my design, but one that will help the mouth to feel especially snake-like. For the full body view of this concept, I kept the form similar to my initial go, but am more intentionally designing the scales. The line of spade-shaped scales in the middle are following what's called the lateral line. This is an anatomical line that goes down either side of a creature. Many fish have scale patterns along the lateral line, or take the giant Japanese salamander for example, which has a ribbon of extra skin that extends down both sides. Including a lateral design in the scales of the lava serpent will help to distinguish between its top and bottom sides. It also gives a clear place that I know I can draw from when designing the belly scales and the back ridge. You can also see I'm thinking about a sort of inlet within the scales running down the belly, maybe as a means of showing the internal glow of heat, or maybe as a weak spot that the players can target, but more on that later. For the rest of the body, I exaggerated the ridge of vents along the back, and after working up a section to follow the form as it rounds the first bend of the serpent, I'm able to do the trick I mentioned before of duplicating and morphing that section to the other parts of my design. I used the warp transform function to make this easy, and then just delete the sections that cross over into the rest of my design. You'll likely have to do some work by hand to make sure that things integrate naturally, but when done carefully, can drastically reduce the amount of time that a concept like this would take. For now, let's talk about color variations. The easiest way to do this is through the hue and saturation adjustment layers, especially if you already have the layers of your concept parsed out. But even if your concept is on a single flattened layer, as I chose to do here, you can mask out the adjustment layers to only affect the parts of the design that you want to change. Let me show you what I mean. Say I have a colorful shape like this on a differently colored background, and a hue and saturation adjustment layer on top, which I selected from this button here. Clicking on the adjustment layer will pull up this properties box where you can make your shifts. Now, because I only want to shift the color of the elliptical shape here, I'm going to clip my adjustment layer by holding Alt or Option while hovering over between the two layers. Here you can see what it looks like as I clip and unclip that adjustment layer. But now with it clipped, I can drag the hue slider to change the ellipse while leaving the background unchanged. However, I suggest selecting the individual color ranges that you want to shift, rather than just shifting it overall. This will give you more control to keep your colors nuanced and believable. And here you can see what it looks like as I toggle that on and off. Lastly, say I wanted my edits to only impact part of the ellipse, rather than the whole thing. To do that, I can click on the adjustment layer's mask here. The white square means that nothing is being masked, and so the whole shape is being affected. But if I take a black brush after selecting the layer mask, I can paint the area where I want the effect to be blocked, returning it to its original state. And you can see the layer mask reflecting this to the right. Hopefully this helps explain what I'm doing in order to create these color variations. There's a lot of technical things happening pretty quickly, so I wanted to break that down a little bit further. I'm only going to show you one of these in depth, as the process is essentially the same for the others, but really it comes down to a bit of trial and error. And don't be surprised if you need to do a bit of paint over on a normal layer in order to, again, make everything look natural. We ended up really liking the original design and some of the cool colors as well, which was thought could be a nice contrast for the player to be able to see the serpent in the warm-colored environment. Plus, it sort of channels the blue energy found in some Godzilla designs, which is always really cool. With that, I move on to updating the head design after receiving feedback to add in the cobra-like hood of my first iteration. Here you can see how I'm reusing the sketch of my concept, but building out the shape of a hood around it. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, I thought you were done with the head, why are you changing it now? Then welcome to concept art. Believe me, the rendering we previously finished will not go to waste, but the process of honing a design means being willing to circle back to the previous iterations to nudge it into its final state. This is where approaching concept art with a mentality of problem solving is crucial. While there are times when concept art gets to be really free and personally expressive, that tends to be near the blue sky phase that we covered, and maybe not even present then. But solving problems can be deeply satisfying too. In this case, the problem, or maybe question is a better term, is what combination of features will showcase the Lava Serpent in its most dynamic light. And if that means taking a feature from your first sketch and working it into your latest, then so be it. There are two different forms for the hood we wanted to try. The first based on the vents I already sketched, and the other based on crystals that the team informed me would be around the environment. When you add these sort of links between a creature and its environment, it makes it seem like it really belongs there, and by extension that you, as the player, are trespassing into its domain. To do this as efficiently as possible, I trace, yes, trace, over the 3D crystal assets that were provided to me by the team. Not only does this ensure that my design references the actual game objects, but it allows me to quickly bang out a selection of crystals that I can then just duplicate across the new hood design. Which you'll note I do right on a copy of the vent hood design that I had just finished. This allowed me to zoom through these new iterations really quickly. At this point, I'm feeling good about the options, and I'm ready to explore the 2 additional states that the team wanted to see. One being the creature in a normal, invulnerable state, and then a more vulnerable state where it's open to be damaged. The state that I had already drawn here would be its vulnerable state, where its hood is open and more of its body is exposed for attack. The invulnerable state, which you see me developing now, is where the hood is pulled closer to the creature's head, making it more compact and shielded. Honestly, it was a bit of a challenge to fold down a complicated form like this, but working from the largest, simplest shapes down to the smallest and most detailed goes a long way to making complex sections work. And if these are skills that you would like to learn, I go into a deep dive on them and much more within my Intro to Concept Art course, which you can check out on my website, also linked in the description. Oh, and I'll just note this quickly since it's the same process as before, but in the top left you can see that I applied the closed hood to the crystal version as well. Again, just working off what I had already finished and duplicating the crystals in place of the vents. With these sketched out, I apply the original and cooler color variations to each hood to see if the vents or crystals read better. These mockups were done pretty loosely, focusing more on color than texture, but they served their purpose. And the team really liked the blue crystalline version, so we moved forward with that. Now I wanted to think more on the belly scale design, and came up with the 2 iterations that you see here. The first with larger squared plates, where the lines between them could show the internal heat glow. The second is more layered and also more complicated, with cutouts in each plate that reveal the glow. And note, these were developed just before I got feedback on which hood we wanted to go with, which is why you see these using the vent design. When sharing these with the team, I got one bit of feedback that was really helpful, which we'll call detail density. This is to be considerate of how fine of detail you're injecting into a design, and keeping the final game model in mind. And having a 3D model that's too complicated can make for several issues. 1, it can bog down the resources of the game engine. 2, it could take exponentially longer to develop. And 3, the details may not even be visible in the final gameplay. Other 3D artists on the team may be able to simplify your concepts when creating the models if needed, but it's better to design the appropriate detail density from the start. For all these reasons, we went with the more squared scale design, and it was explained that it would probably have to be simplified a bit from what I drew, especially in areas like this where the detail density was just too fine. Now, as an expansion of the creature's vulnerable state, I explored what battle damage might look like, as part of the hood and scales get broken and maybe the tail gets severed. What damage can be shown depends a good deal on what's feasible within the game engine. Adding chips and scratches can often be accomplished by updating the texture of the concept, but when you start to show that large portions are broken or cut off, that's changing the actual geometry of the model itself, and may be more complicated to implement. The team was super happy with where this was going, and all that was left was for me to tie it together, specifically with a full body view in a swimming pose, since the battle takes place underwater and I had thus far been drawing it on land. You'll also see the addition of vents along the lateral sides of the serpent too, which we agreed would be a nice visual to indicate why the player takes damage from the sides of the serpent. I'm trying to limit some of the time-lapse footage where I'm jumping all over the canvas like this. But needless to say, having the details of the concept established through my previous poses made this process a lot easier. For the vulnerable state, I drew the serpent twisting itself into a knot, which was inspired by something truly bizarre. There exist in some portions of the deep oceans what are called brine pits. These look like undersea lakes and have a salinity of 3 to 8 times that of the surrounding ocean and much lower oxygen levels. Because of this, when animals unsuited to it, such as this eel, venture in, they go into a sort of shock, causing convulsions like you see here. This is just wild to me, but as it turns out, perfect reference to inform the vulnerable state of the lava serpent. With that, I color the final concept, following a similar process that I used when rendering out the head. This is to create a primary image that the 3D modelers can use in bringing the concept forward. One of the most rewarding parts of my experience was working alongside such talented artists and learning from their processes. I'm always trying to improve my workflows to make my concepts more useful to the teams I'm a part of. And this project was really helpful in showing me where I can keep improving. However, it's good for me to remember that I can't rely on contract work alone in order to bring that growth. To be transparent, one of the hardest parts of doing freelance work is keeping your drive going once the project ends, and with it all the accountability of a team and the motivation of a paycheck. I've learned that 1, creativity loves momentum, and 2, progress is often an uphill venture, which means that if you're not consistently pouring into your craft, it's easy to backslide and for your skills to lose their edge. This doesn't mean that we need to obsess over productivity and adopt the so-called grind set mentality, but it does mean exploring the unforced rhythms by which you can continually be practicing your craft. For me, this is where personal projects and sketching come into play. I'm guilty as anyone of going longer than I should without engaging with these things. But having the aim of always coming back to something that you're passionate about will keep you sharp for when the next project comes along. If you want to learn more of the techniques that I use to design AAA creature concepts like this, you should check out the self-guided course on my website. It contains a whole month's worth of lectures, demos, and assignments. In it, we'll break down how to make a functional creature design, from initial thumbnails to designing from the largest shapes to final details, developing different poses and color schemes, then designing the final concept sheets. With the concept sheets finalized and delivered, that about wraps up the development of this piece, but for one thing, a fully illustrated scene showing the lava serpent in its environment. Comment what you would like to see next, and until next time, I'll see you later.